The First World War took place between July 1914 and November 1918, although, and this is the first time we've seen this, a separate line for U.S. involvement. The U.S. entered fairly late, didn't join the war until April 1917. Some thought the U.S. should have entered sooner, some thought it never should have entered at all. Mostly, for most of the war, though, Americans were against it. They were against getting involved. That frontier-fueled imperial aspiration that we looked at through the Spanish-American War, um, that had in large part fizzled by this point. Americans knew that their nation was a world power. They'd achieved their manifest destiny. There was no empire to be gotten in Europe. Really, this was Europe's war, was the feeling. On the whole, Americans were isolationist in terms of their foreign policy, and we'll get back to that. So then to go to the cause for war, the reason for fighting, well, the aspirational goal that really pushed the U.S. into the war was high-minded, idealistically, very shiny. The goal of making the world safe for democracy, and that came in late. That came in with America's entry and Woodrow Wilson's speech to Congress. We'll turn to that. So I've listed that here, but the truth is that the cause of World War I has never been clear. It's never been settled. It's not something that historians agree on. Most directly, most immediately, in June of 1914, a Serbian nationalist shot and killed the heir presumptive to the Austria-Hungarian throne, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, pictured here, along with his wife, while the two were visiting Sarajevo. This is just before he gets shot and killed. So first, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, then Russia comes in on Serbia's side, then Germany on Austria-Hungary's side, then France on the side of Serbia. Germany tries to get to France by tromping through Belgium, which brings Great Britain into the war, and on and on and on, in a case of really just tragically spiraling momentum. Russia, France, and Great Britain made a deal in December 1914 not to make a separate peace, and that's how we got the Allied powers. That thus became the Allied powers. So over 30 nations declared war in between 1914 and 1918. The Central Powers were those against whom the Allied powers were fighting, and many of the flags of the Central Powers here are client states for a bunch of empires dissolved at this point, and so a lot of the flags that you see here are actually smaller states within what were previously empires called into battle, and then the Allied powers on the left. And what began as a relatively small conflict in southeastern Europe really very quickly grew into a massive, unprecedented global war. Here's some slides depicting numbers, which you can pause and look at closely. Over 65 million men served in mass citizen armies, some volunteer, mostly conscripted. Over very close to 20 million people died, both combatant and civilian. What you see on the right is the casualty rate for different fighting forces, and you can see Russia, 76% casualty rate, which includes wounded and missing. Again here, as in the American Civil War, technology outstripped tactics. Industrialization introduced weapons and machinery that greatly increased the killing power of armies. Advances in defense tactics and in medicine were just no match for the newfound and newly mass-produced instruments of death. Aircraft were introduced into warfare here, increasing dramatically the vulnerability of everyone on the ground, combatant or not. Modern machine guns and rapid-fire field artillery guns were pretty new, and were what really forced armies into trenches, which was not an ideal form of warfare. Then neither was the alternative. Trench warfare was gruesome and horribly ineffective on any measure other than that of death. Trenches were generally 50 to 250 yards apart from one another, and they made creepingly slow advance over the years during which armies spent their lives there, where they advanced at all. For the most part, they just really didn't move, the trench lines. Once they dug in, they didn't move much. Young men by the millions charged over the top, where they met mortars, bayonets, barbed wire, rifles, machine guns, hand-to-hand combat, tanks. Neither side had significant success. Neither side gained advantage in this this method of warfare. And yeah, tanks were introduced here. That's an early one on the left, middle. Along with grenades, poison gas was introduced, submarines, flamethrowers. Just the scale of death and destruction, aerial bombings, and just mowing down massive line drives of men who, ran straight for it. It was unprecedented. It really shocked the world's sense of meaning and value and purpose. And the literature of the Lost Generation, as well as the Dada movement and art, are a couple direct responses to that perceived meaninglessness. And we can sort of see this as the beginning of what would become the postmodern era. This was the first big war where more were killed in military action than by disease, although disease certainly took its toll. But back to the cause. The cause of war, or really the causes, there were multiple. They're complicated, they're argued over. There was that first and most direct incitement, the killing of Archduke Ferdinand. Also, the mutual defense alliances that were already in place propelled increased entry into combat. The widespread imperial aspirations, which we saw in the Spanish-American War era, and the nationalism, that sense of national superiority that it inspired, fueled belligerence across the spectrum of the fighters. But really, if I had to land somewhere, I'd land on the industrializing forces, the arms race, the stockpiling of weaponry, and the increased militarism that came along with that. Everybody was ready. Everybody was primed. Nations had a whole lot of new weapons, and they wanted to use them, and they had the capacity through the burgeoning industrial system to transform massive factories into weapons makers. And so not only did they have a stockpile of weapons, they also knew that they could very quickly multiply that by orders of magnitude. They wanted to use that. The people, sort of masses, were brought on board or encouraged through propaganda, which thrived during this time, and which often demonized the national character of enemy peoples. And so nationalism sort of urged on the industrialized war machine. You have your British, French, and German posters from the time. In general, Europe approached the war at the start with enthusiasm, with patriotism, with excitement, won over and entranced by the power of machines and by the high-minded ideologies of progress-oriented conquest and the nationalisms that drove that. They thought it would be short. Once in, it proved, as it turns out, all but impossible to get out. So again, tragically spiraling momentum. America resisted the sirens of war for quite some time, and for a variety of reasons. President Woodrow Wilson, who was not inclined to or won over by the allure of war at all, pretty immediately declared U.S. neutrality in August 1914. And Americans were on the whole on board with that. We have to remember that at this point, intercontinental travel was very slow. Crossing the Atlantic, getting from America to Europe, it took anywhere from 6 to 14 weeks, depending on weather. Right? If there's a storm, it might take you a while. You run out of supplies on the way. It was difficult travel. So Europe was far away. It was distant. It was way over there. It was, it was foreign. And since Washington, America had claimed to resist European entanglements. There was a sense that that world was the old world, and getting involved was not going to lead anywhere positive. American watched the progress of the war on newsreels, which were also new at the time, and the sheer scale of death, the massive carnage that they saw there, struck most Americans as pointless. Plus, following that period of increased and really record-breaking immigration that we had at the turn of the century, we're just past that and really kind of still at the tail end of it, there were immigrants in America with ties to both sides. So, half of the country's industrial workers were either European immigrants or their children, the children of those direct immigrants. So the inclination was to an isolationist foreign policy, and Wilson really tried to maintain that. He ran for re-election in 1916, promising to keep America out of the war, promising what he called a just peace. His campaign slogans both spoke directly to this maintaining of neutrality. He kept us out of the war, showed up everywhere, and America first, which began as an anti-war isolationist slogan, but really quickly found its way into just isolationism and defensiveness. through KKK, fascist sympathizers, into and through the mid-century, and then has maintained a kind of populist isolationist movement today. At this point, it was an anti-war slogan, isolationist, but anti-war. And he won, though not by a terribly wide margin. So Wilson stays in the White House in 1916, in the middle of the war. The inclination of Americans was towards isolation and neutrality. But it was only an inclination, and for most it wasn't a firm stance. For some it was, and we'll look at Eugene Debs and others next time. But for most, it wasn't. Several things served to sort of tip that balance and pull American sentiment towards war. It wasn't really there at the beginning, but the things that helped to push it there, early in the war, very early, August 4th, 1914, the same day that Wilson declares U.S. neutrality, in fact, the German army invaded Belgium, which was a neutral country. This shocked the world. Invading a neutral country, and the kind of brutality that followed and the photographic evidence of that. This is what actually brought Great Britain into the war. And Germany was just really trying to get in the back way to Germany shares a border with France, but that border was blockaded by French soldiers. So rather than try to fight their way through, they wanted to get in the back way through Belgium. It's a little bit of a cheat. Americans watched again on newsreels and in newspapers what was going on in Belgium with shock and with increasing dismay. Non-combatants were being slaughtered, towns were being burned to the ground, all so that German army could get in the back way into France. Then, on May 7th, 1915, a German submarine fired on and sunk the German passenger ship, the Lusitania, which had been secretly decked out for war and was secretly carrying munitions, but the passengers on it did not know that. There was no warning. There were American passengers on board, and this really helped to galvanize an American anti-German sentiment that would lead to an American preference for war over isolationism. Remember, the Lusitania became a rally cry in some ways. And this anti-German sentiment really swept through America, where according to the 1910 census, 1 in 11 Americans was first or second generation German. So there's really a lot of Germans here. And remember, Theodore Roosevelt was calling for 100% Americanism, as we saw that quote. He's still around at this point. He was, no hyphenated identity. So this was an ad taken out in a paper, and it was very common. It was thought that being German American was impossible, was a contradiction in terms. So towns, there's a bit of a hysteria that built around this. Towns with names that had anything to do with Germany changed their names. Sauerkraut was called Liberty Cabbage. It's familiar, right? Hamburgers were Liberty Steaks. Cities, counties, and states banned the German language. They banned the playing of Bach and Beethoven and Mozart. Then, a couple years after the Lusitania, in February 1917, Germany resumes the unrestricted submarine warfare that it had dabbled with in 1915, but really quickly backed off from, which meant that as of February 1917, it fired on any and all ships in the war zone. Passenger ships, neutral ships, merchant ships, didn't matter. Unrestricted submarine warfare in February of 1917. And so that's affecting America. America is shipping, and also there were American passengers, not many. Travel had, taken a slowdown, but there were still some. Great Britain had already begun seizing the cargo of U.S. ships that they thought might be heading to Germany. So, that had already been happening. Germany had long been threatening to torpedo U.S. ships in British waters, but this, unrestricted submarine warfare really carried these threats to a new level and caught America's attention. In March of 1917, German submarines sunk several American ships carrying cargo. And at about the same time was the Zimmermann telegram, known as the Zimmermann telegram, named after the German foreign minister who sent it to the German ambassador in Mexico City, which the British intercepted, they decoded, and eventually they showed to Americans. They took their time because they didn't want the Germans to know that they had cracked their code, but eventually they did. And in it, Germany offers to help Mexico to recover the lands that Mexico ceded during the Mexican-American War in exchange for Mexico supporting Germany in this First World War. So it was very clear with unrestricted submarine warfare and also with the Zimmerman telegram that this was no longer just Europe's war. America was not going to be able to be isolationist. So on April 2nd, 1917, Wilson appears before Congress to make the case for war, and in doing so, he gives a rally cry to a generation, and perhaps inadvertently, maybe even ironically, he sets the stage for what has become over a century of nearly constant international wars waged on the premise and inspired by the moral mandates of American exceptionalism. This is somebody who really tried to stay out of war, and in asking Congress to declare war, created the stance that has driven American martial policy into today. In 1994, Henry Kissinger writes, "It is to the drumbeat of Wilsonian idealism that American foreign policy has marched since his watershed presidency and continues to march to this day." And that hasn't changed since 94. If anything, those drums beat just a little more loudly. In that April 2nd, 1917 speech calling upon Congress to declare war, and remember that this was well before Congress had abdicated that central duty and thereby betrayed the American people in its own constitutional mandate, pretty much ensuring perpetual war under another name. It was before then, so Congress did need to approve and declare war. Anyway, speaking to Congress, Wilson says this: "The world must be made safe for democracy." Bing, there's your motto. But he goes on, "Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty. We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest, no dominion. We seek no indemnities for ourselves, no material compensation for the sacrifices we shall freely make. We are but one of the champions of the rights of mankind. Our goal," he says, "is to vindicate the principles of peace and justice. We would fight," he says, "for the ultimate peace of the world and for the liberation of all peoples," including, he notes several times and at length, the German people. So he tries very much as we declare war to make clear that we're declaring war against an army, not a people. American sentiment, as we've seen, and that it was already, had a pretty virulent anti-German thing going on. It was already anti-immigrant in a lot of quarters, and that continued as we entered the war. So he tries. America doesn't really take that. He closes with a commitment to, quote, "make the world at last itself free." And in his last lines, he brings us back to the revolution. These are his last lines. "To such a task we dedicate our lives and our fortunes, everything we are and everything we have, with the pride of those who know that the day has come when America is privileged to spend her labor and her might and her blood for the principles that gave her birth and happiness and peace, which she has treasured. God helping her, she can do no other." He says to Congress and through Congress to the American people, though not many of the American public heard this speech. There was no YouTube. Congressional speeches didn't generally get printed in full. There were quotes in newspapers, but he tells Congress, in effect, if you believe in America, in the exceptional nature of its founding and its divinely sanctioned destiny, then take us to war. You have to take us to war. This was not new in Wilson. He had long believed in a kind of providential nationalism. America was special and God was involved. In a 1912 campaign speech, so a few years back when he's running for his first term in office, in the White House, and a couple of years before the war starts, he says this: "I believe that God presided over the inception of this nation. I believe that God planted in us the vision of liberty. I cannot be deprived of the hope that is in me, the hope that not only concerns myself, but that concerns the nation, that we are chosen to show the way to the nations of the world, how they shall walk in the path of liberty." And so we see different variations on sort of a kind of Lady Liberty who's being called to wake up. And this was coursing through American self-understanding at the time. And on April 6th, 1917, Congress follows Wilson's counsel of 4 days before and votes to declare war against Germany. And America very quickly mobilizes. The draft was introduced on May 18th, 1917, and U.S. troops were organized as the American Expeditionary Forces, or AEF. By the end of the year, a year and a half later, nearly 5 million U.S. troops had served as part of the first U.S. deployment abroad to defend foreign soil. The U.S. entered the war not as one of the Allied powers, but as what was called an associated power. And this is where the at this point famous Uncle Sam image gets introduced through recruiting posters. And on January 8th, 1918, Wilson gives another speech to Congress in which he lays out 14 points. He was the only public leader to publicly state his war aims, and he really tried to do so here. He laid out the goals of the U.S. in entering the war and the plans for peace upon that war's completion. One of the 14 points, as you can see at the bottom, number 14, was the establishment of a League of Nations. In that speech, he called World War I, quote, the final war for human liberty. It was not Wilson, incidentally, though, who dubbed this the war to end all wars, which it's also been called. That's been picked up. That was H.G. Wells, the author of The War of the Worlds and Time Machine and The Invisible Man. But Wilson did want to end all wars. He wanted to replace old world rivalries with a community of nations dedicated to democracy, liberal democracy, and free enterprise. Liberal democracy and free enterprise on the American model. He believed that these would bring lasting peace to the world, because, of course. These were for Wilson, and for most Americans today, they remain not simply American principles. They're universal principles. They're the principles of all humankind. Everybody wants what we have, is the sort of underlying assumption. And whether they know it or not, everybody wants our help in getting it. And this is at the heart of American exceptionalism. There's a connection, more than an affinity, really a deep sense of consonance between America's project and the will of God, between Americans' project and humanitarian reason for the more secular among us. Destiny, along with all things good and right and just, calls upon the U.S. to make globally available the universal virtues and blessings of our way of life. Again, liberal democracy and free enterprise. And, anyone who wouldn't want those things is unenlightened or treasonous. And we see here, in the Wilson depicted in the White House attic and pulling out that big stick of Theodore Roosevelt, right? This just might be the new thing. And this notion that that's what America needed. We needed to go back to that era of, a kind of very harsh diplomacy, a warlike diplomacy, a sense of our own superiority that we then use against the world. You see Wilson, who was characteristically very different from Teddy Roosevelt in terms of, politics, and especially stands towards war and fighting, at this point is seen as taking a turn towards that tendency. And we will turn next time to the Espionage and Sedition Acts that were passed in order to make sure that those who spoke ill of this enlightened American spreading of American universal values would be punished, right? Unenlightened or treasonous. That's what you have to be if you don't believe that American values are universal values. Anyone who considers as really potentially viable and independently, inherently valuable alternatives to this liberal democracy and free enterprise, or this, post-capitalist hellscape of political corruption, depending on how you look at it. Anyone who considers the alternatives presented and embodied by other nations as authentically valuable, they're on the wrong side of patriotism. Then, as now, America understands itself as making the world safe for democracy. Wilson sought a world, military historian Andrew Bacevich tells us. He sought a world remade in America's image and therefore permanently at peace. Now, of course, America wasn't truly at peace on its own soil. Of course, this was itself a myth built on and buoyed by America's own sense of exceptional status, as Bacevich goes on to chronicle, and as we'll see a little bit of next time. But hindsight clarifies a great deal, and the image America projected at the time, and which it seems Wilson himself authentically believed in and strived in his own, albeit ineffectual way, to manifest, That image was of a nation founded on a universal sense of justice, a sense of justice that was applicable the world over. And in fact, in geopolitical and diplomatic terms, as historian Arthur Herman tells us, World War I did establish America as, quote, the arbiter of a new world order, one that would be built around America's economic strength, military power, and moral authority as promoter and defender of democracy and freedom. And it's pretty unambiguous that this war did establish America as the greatest of the great powers. And we see in our contemporary living myths and the rhetoric of today that we still understand ourselves as defenders the world over of democracy and freedom. Now, Wilson's speech detailing the 14 points was taken at the time by Congress and by most who had access to it to be really idealistic, to be unrealistic. It was too much. It depended too much on the goodwill and altruistic rationality of the international community, which was itself being redefined at the time. Borders were being redrawn. He wanted a lasting and just peace, and he had just enough high-minded idealism, moralism, and maybe a little bit, hubris to think that he could usher that in. A kind of peace was, in fact, found in the form of an armistice, which is like a ceasefire as treaties are negotiated, and was itself signed on at the 11th hour, on the 11th day of the 11th month, so November 11th at the 11th hour, not U.S. time. The symbol of this sort of the very last minute, very last minute, it wasn't lost on the world at the time. All of the Central Powers, other than Germany, had by this point already surrendered, so this was the final surrender of Germany to the Allied powers. And by November of 1918, so much had been lost of life and treasure, so little had been gained by anybody, and a flu pandemic erupted to boot, further diminishing the martial energy of the world, with Europe exhausted, their battalions decimated, their populations demoralized by the soul-crushing casualty count, the previously unfathomable material destruction, right? In that context, the American economic, manufacturing, and military contributions really were decisive. The U.S. did make possible the winning of the war. The Treaty of Versailles was signed and really stuck it to Germany, requiring enormous monetary reparations and including a guilt clause blaming Germany for the war. And this set the stage for World War II. America didn't sign it, had an independent treaty with Germany. At Versailles, the League of Nations was established with 42 founding nations. The U.S. did not join, mostly because isolationists in Congress strongly resisted the foreign entanglements it promised, and they also resisted the foreign wars that those entanglements were sure to lead to. Wilson was, however, awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1919 for his efforts. So World War I. It gave us passports, modern prosthetics, Pilates, plastic surgery, daylight savings time, the remembrance symbol of the poppy. It gave us a whole lot of industrial and material technological developments. It also gave us Major General Smedley Butler. And we'll close now with a look at him. His was a life of exemplary and deeply critical service to the United States Marine Corps and to the country. He's one of history's most highly decorated Marines. He began his career in the Marine Corps at age 17 in that unabashed land grab that was the Spanish-American War, and ended that career following the First World War. At the time of his death in 1940, Butler was the most highly decorated Marine in U.S. history. 16 medals, 5 for individual heroism. He earned the Medal of Honor twice for 2 separate events. His loyalty to the Corps and to the United States, it's really unassailable. If his service didn't make that clear, then his participation in what's known as the business plot did. So in 1933, this is after the war, but before this book that you read, pamphlet that you read is written, in 1933, a small group of very wealthy men actually tried to overthrow the reform-minded government of FDR. They approached Butler, asked him to raise an army, march on the Capitol, take it, and prepare for their imposition of a fascist state. Fascism was actually quite popular in America, especially in America's financial corridors of power at this time. This is before World War II. And Butler responds with this: if you get 500,000 soldiers advocating anything that smells like fascism, I'll get 500,000 more and lick the hell out of you, and we'll have a real war right here at home. This really happened. There were congressional hearings. Nobody was jailed or anything like that. But Butler wasn't a pacifist. That's what to indicate to him there were things worse than wounds and worse than death. And after he retired in 1931, he worked to tell the world just what those things were through the book that you've read. Worse than death for Butler was the betrayal of an ideal, the ideal of honor, courage, and commitment that is central to the Marine Corps, of freedom and democracy, of self-sacrifice for a greater good. And that betrayal, as he saw it in the Spanish-American War and in World War I, was in the interest of money, of profit. War is a racket, you read. It's possibly the oldest, easily the most profitable, surely the most vicious. It's the only one in which profits are reckoned in dollars and losses in lives. Butler followed the money, and the story he tells is really Kafkaesque. Think back to the story of the shoes and the saddles, right? It's Kafkaesque, except that it's also a century later routine. Great profits continue to accrue to what are now called defense contractors. In 2011, Andrew Bacevich tells us, quote, government investigators determined that war planners had wasted $60 billion on contract fraud and abuse in Iraq and Afghanistan, about $1 for every $3.50 spent on contractors in those countries over the last decade. In other words, losses amounted to something on the order of $12 million every day for the last 10 years. That's not expenditures, that's losses. And that was, about 10 years ago. The situation has not changed. Butler points us to the true cost of war. It's a horrible accounting. He tells us it comes in lives and the physical and mental and social health of the veterans who make it home and of their families, but it also comes in the gargantuan debt that the war, World War I as well as our contemporary war, saddles future generations with. We just leave this unthinkable debt onto future generations. They'll deal with it, we say, as long as we don't have to pay the debt. He points us to how those in power use myths to move people, move them to war, and to do so for profit. And his is a call to civilian awareness of the realities of war, of participation in it, and of the financial cost, which is also a cost in justice. Now, Bacevich, whom I've quoted a few times now, he calls this kind of critique, when we see it today, and we often do, he calls it the Smedley syndrome, where senior U.S. military officers retire and then, and only then, call into question some basic sanctioned truths, agreement with which, or at least acceptance of and basic adherence to, was part of the progress of their career. Smedley Butler spent his retirement years traveling, speaking, running for office, advocating for veterans. But Bacevich is right. He didn't speak out when he wore the uniform. Not as flawed as a lot of the mythic sort of heroes, American heroes we've looked at so far, but still, turns out, only human, far from perfect. It may be that rank and honor pose their own challenge to him, to Smedley Butler. Next time, we'll look at some of the challenges, some of the financial and social and political challenges that Americans at home faced during World War I, and at how those challenges, those stateside, domestic, home front challenges have continued to shape our, the myths that we have inherited from that era.